Okay, yeah. Give me 1 second, sorry. I'm getting my mic timer set up. Okay, so yep, like I said, I want POIs through the hand raise emoji, like the thing at like the react button, and I'll remind that in speech too. Yeah, that's what it was. Okay, is anybody not ready? In unresolved criminal cases, this House will require the police to pay significant compensation to the victims. I'll start on framing, then I'll get down to my main point of matter, which is the principle of reparations and justice. Okay, starting on framing, just I'm gonna do some definitions. Like, what does it mean to like require the police to pay? I like to say that it goes like we would like to say that it goes out like the city budgets. It goes out of like the local areas funds. Because the reality here is that like police themselves are generally underfunded. I think this gets to the bigger idea of like more so than the police, it's the justice system itself, and the justice system is represented by the state. The state is the justice system. We say this is reasonable since it's still like the institution, the like same institution paying. Now going on to like what is the idea of like a significant compensation, since that's going to be pretty like important to this. We like to say that it's generally pretty relative to the crime. However, for example, we like to say like in murder, we'd say it's probably providing like $35,000, or which is approximately like half of a year of median income. Or we like to say that that on standard is probably up in that section of like half a year of median income to a full year of median income, depending on like the severity of the crime. Next on, like, what does it mean to it be like an unresolved case? We like to say that it's a case that's gone cold for 6 months. So that means like no news, like significant developments. That means like the case has gone dry, and there's a lack of new evidence, and they're not able to like make any forward progress with the case. Now, what do these actually look like? Like, oftentimes these unresolved cases are actually instances of like are like aggravated cases. What is that? That's like sorry, trigger warning, but this is kind of like what they are. It's like homicide, rape, and aggravated assault. That's the general like that's generally what these unresolved cases, and especially the ones that go cold, and the ones that like end up being like what we consider unresolved cases. Now, why do these go unresolved? They go unresolved because they lack new concrete evidence. Oftentimes these cases go unresolved not because they're lacking new evidence, but because evidence in the past was weak on its own, and it was hard to like it was hard to, even though they know the crime occurred, it was just hard in the evidence they did have to get more extrapolations and figure out like what was the root source and like find the perpetrator. And now the reality is that most of these unresolved cases are actually never solved. So or even if they are solved, they're solved like decades later through like deathbed like admissions. The reality here is that the reason like we know about these unresolved cases, it generally is because the reason like they're thinking like this like in the idea of like media today is because they're cases that have been cold for decades, and no one knows like how to actually solve them. We like to say that 6 months is a good standard, because generally in most of these cases it is like around 6 months. Now, I like to take any POIs. Does anyone have any POIs on the framing, or is everyone okay with the framing? Okay, I see no POIs, so I will assume that everyone's okay with the framing. Now I'll go down to my main positive point of matter, which is the principle of reparations and justice. So starting off like just a quick intuition pump, like what does this actually look like? Like for example, like why do we have this idea of like a justice system? There's just like what we do for prosecuting crimes and like doing these investigations in the first place is not only about like just punishing the perpetrator, but it's also for a deeper idea of like showing the victims that those who wronged them are getting this idea of justice done to them. Why is it called the justice system? Because it's the idea that like these people who caused the crime on the victim are not getting away. They're getting their just desserts. And what we see here is that like we generally seek justice like in like a cultural sense. We see like reparations for like minorities being a topic. We talk about how like for example, like why is colonialism such like a big like topic of like a topic in the West? Well, it's about it's about like recognizing it and putting in place measures to like get justice for these people. The reality is that justice is a really key part of society, and that's like the intuitive level of that. Now, going on to what is the comparative and why in the op world you actually not see justice for these peoples. What we see here is that in the op world, like I said earlier, most of these unresolved cases are never solved or solved decades later. What we see is that these victims never actually get to know, get to know not only who are the ones that got it's less about like knowing who are the ones who wronged them, but it's more about knowing that those people may have gotten just scot-free, and while their lives have been fundamentally changed, they are off living their best lives. We see here in the comparative, these people never get any sense of justice. Well, how we solve in the government side is by giving them a significant compensation. What we are doing is we are providing these people some sort of we're providing these people some sort of compensation. We were not able to give them justice. This is where reparations come in. This principle of reparations and why reparations good. It's because reparations is like a localized form of justice where we are acknowledging these people, acknowledging that they have been wronged, and we are instead of giving them nothing to walk away with, we are giving them something as an acknowledgement. I haven't gotten actually any POIs, or maybe the if anyone has a POI, just please unmute. I think maybe the recorded thing might have blocked the hand raise signal. If anyone had any.
So if you take money away from the city or the police, would it not make it harder to prevent future crimes?
So here's the thing, like that's why I say it's more like yeah. So how would it make it harder to prevent future crimes? We'd say no. We'd actually say that that the reason it doesn't actually prevent money like these future crimes from being happen is because usually these unresolved cases are not unresolved because of a lack of funding. They're unresolved because of lack of like being able to find new concrete evidence and being able to find new leads. The reality is that funding is not actually the main like pinch point in like 99% of these investigation. It's actually it's actually the it's actually like this lack of evidence. And like the second thing here is that we like to say that like on average a lot of these unresolved cases are pretty rare. And so it's not actually going to be like some massive like tank to all the budgets of cities like all across the nation. And so like what are the direct harms? The reality is that the victims of like these aggravated crimes, like these crimes in general, have like the crimes weigh in the victim's mental state, and it's a fundamental change to their view like their life. What we see here is that like they have this view of like the aggressor got away. While they may have like this trauma that they're holding for the rest of their life, the aggressor got away. And what we see here is that we like how we feel this is we to give them some sense of solace and allow them to return to some sense of normality in their life. Thank you, panel.
Thank you for that, Colleague Leader Fob.
Am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, great. Okay, so my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Just because some people will be able to get justice on side government doesn't justify giving more injustices to other people existing in society or future criminals. Very proud to oppose. I just want to start off with like one clarification. I think that side OJ tried to talk about like, oh, now we're going to give this money out of city budgets. But I think the motion specifically says that police is going to pay. So I think that side OJ needs to take a harder stance in explaining why the underfunded police like actually paying these kind of compensation is something really, really good for them on their side of the house. Given that, moving on to 3 materials that I want to give to you from opening opposition. First, I want to talk about our framing. I would like to talk about why the status quo is good enough in terms of incentivizing the police to do effective investigations, right? I think there's 3 structural reasons as to why this is true. First of all, I think that people that generally join the police have a strong feeling of justice to begin with. I think like working as a police officer generally is like physically very hard labor, and I think that it's not really as well paying as, for example, like the financial sector, become like a banker, for example, right? So I think that at the moment that people actively choose to become police officer, mean that they have a really strong feeling of justice and they want to like solve as many cases as possible. Secondly, I think there's still lots of media scrutiny on police operations still existing on our side of the house. So I think because I think generally people care about their safety and they have a lot of awareness towards like the police investigations in the first place, right? So I think that there's still lots amount of pressure. But thirdly, I think there's also pressure from victims to resolve cases anyways on our side of the house. For all these three structural reasons, I think there's still several mechanisms as to incentivize police to still do like very effective investigations anyways on our side of the house. I don't think that actually forcing police to give out money is like a very unique mechanism that OG needs. OG needs to provide, like side government needs to prove that why incentivizing, like forcing people to police to give compensation is such a strong incentivizing factors for like in terms of like effective investigations. I'll take a POI around like 5 minutes. Getting into our second substantive, I want to talk about like why this is generally going to be counterproductive in terms of investigations of the police. And I just want to flag out here that like our burden is not to prove that like our capacity is going to significantly rise on our side of the house in terms of investigations, but rather if we are just able to prove that why on side government, like there's like investigation is going to be significantly unsolved, significantly more unsolved on their side of the house. I think that's the win to our side of the house, right? So I don't think like we need to prove like why rape cases or like really hard cases to solve are now going to be suddenly solved on our side of the house. If we're able to prove like more rape cases or more other kinds of forms of crime are more unlikely to be solved on their side of the house, that means that's a win to our side of the house. So given that, moving on to our substantives. Why is it first counterproductive? I think that there are mainly two broad reasons. The first reason is that it basically takes away financial resources away from the police that is already underfunded, as OG concedes it, right? I think that this generally significantly decreases the capacity of the police to actually do investigations, right? But I just want to first of all explain why it's like a lot of money is going to be taken away from the police in the first place, right? Because OG kind of talked about like say that, oh, like this is going to be really, really rare and not much money is going to be taken out. I think there's mainly two reasons as to why a lot of money is going to be taken out. First of all, I think that the police need to like compensate for past unsolved cases as well, right? That are basically like were basically unsolved because of like lack of techniques, for example, like because they didn't have good DNA tests, or just because of like things like lack of evidence, right? And I think like there's a lot of past unsolved cases that they need to now compensate for, which also leads to a significant amount. But secondly, I think that even if like the amount of like unsolved cases isn't that large or is very rare to begin with, I think that at the moment that those cases can accumulate, that can actually lead to a large amount even on their side of the house, right? So therefore, I think that a lot of money is actually going to be taken out for the police, and that significantly decreases the capacity for mainly four reasons. First of all, I think it generally leads to the decrease of numbers of officers that can engage in investigation. Secondly, I think the amount of tests that they can use, scientific tests that they can use to investigation, for example, things like DNA tests or like biometric data, are also going to significantly decrease the accuracy of, for example, investigations, right? But thirdly, I think that also like in terms of like daily safety or like crime prevention, those kind of actions are also going to significantly decrease, right? I think the safety reinforcing mechanisms like patrol are also going to decrease. But not only that, I think that the officer training capacity of the police organization as a whole is also going to decrease, generally all leading to the less efficiency of the police as a whole. The impact of this is simple. I think less cases are going to be resolved on their side of the house. I think more rape cases, more like robbery cases are going to be unsolved on their side of the house. On the counterfactual, because we can actually use all these money into investigations and prevent all these like inefficiencies on our side of the house, I think we can generally solve more cases comparatively on our side of the house. Moving on to the second reason, I think that even if we take their best case and say that, oh, in some instances, maybe there are going to be more cases resolved on their side of the house, I think this is generally going to lead to more harmful investigations on their side of the house, right? Because I think that there's going to be a lot of pressure from bosses, for example, or superiors, because generally police don't want to pay for these like compensations, right? So what this means is mainly two things. First of all, I think it's going to lead to like more harsher interrogations within like interrogations, right? So which can actually lead to more false accusations, which is really, really harmful. But secondly, I think can also lead to like more police brutality on their side of the house, right? I think that when more police are going to go and patrol in minority districts, for example, and have more interrogations or abuse on the streets on a daily basis on their side of the house, which is very, very bad. Comparatively, I think because there's going to be less of an incentive to do this, comparatively, all these things like police brutality or false accusations is significantly going to decrease. I'll take a POI.
So if it's true that the police are generally thorough with their investigations, then surely the policy will only be activated at very special instances only. Why will the financial capacity of the police will be significantly affected?
Because I just told you, like, first of all, they have to compensate for massive amounts of past past unsolved cases in the first place, which have already stacked up a lot. But even if that, like, if that's not the case, I think like even having like, for example, 10 cases per year, which is also like, for example, millions of dollars, which is also significantly harmful. Given that, moving on to the weighing that I want to talk about, I think there's mainly two pieces of weighing. First of all, I think generally, even if we take their best case and say that, oh, there's like more compensation and more justice to people on the ground, I think that generally like solving cases more is something more important than having a higher chance of compensation, right? Why is that the case? Because I think victims generally care about having more cases solved, right? Because even if you get more money, the fact that you had trauma, for example, or the fact that, for example, the person that killed your loved one is still living out in society and is like not being in jail actually is very traumatizing and something that's really, really harmful to your own mental health, right? I think actively seeing that retribution, seeing that person actually being put in jail or like actually serving sentences is something, a really important factor for you, like to actually feel safe or to actually feel like you have been brought to justice, right? I think this can only be achieved by solving cases. But finally, I think that even if that's not the case, I think that actually having more minorities be oppressed on their side of that's something is something even more bad, because I think that we're reinforcing structural violence. I think even more like vulnerable people are going to be much more harmed comparatively on their side of the house, which is not a just reason to give justice to some individuals on their side of the house, right? I think we affect a more larger amount of minorities generally. Therefore, it's really, really bad. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you for that, Adrian.
Okay, is anybody not ready? Panel, it is imperative that you uphold this resolution in order to seek reparations and justice for the victims. This was a principle that was largely unresponded to actually by the opposition. However, I'll get onto some rebuttal. So on this idea of like the underfunded police paying, first of all, like they should have asked this earlier. I literally asked for any POIs on my framing. However, I'll respond to anyways. Secondly, like this is probably a relatively small bit to the budget. They go into that later, and I'll go into that a little bit deeper. But like largely a lot of these cases are rare. Like on this idea of like cases accumulate, it's not like 10 cases per year. Most of these unresolved cases are like pretty rare cases to begin with, like more aggravated things, like homicide, like aggravated assault. These are pretty rare cases to begin with. And two, it's usually, especially nowadays where we have a lot more like CCTV, most of these cases actually, like 90% of these cases actually end up being solved. The ones that are unresolved are very rare. And next up, on this idea of like past unresolved cases, like creating a big like backlog. First of all, I like to say that the government actually creates like an incentive to look back into these past unresolved cases. Actually, like I said earlier, which was actually a rebuttal that was not responded to by the opposition leader at all. The majority of these times, the reason these cases run cold is not because of a lack of funding, but it's because of a lack of evidence. A lot of these past unresolved cases, one, I like to say that there's probably not that many for the same reasons I said before about them being like rare in the first place, Secondly, they're largely distributed throughout the entire country, so it's not like one like every single police officer is getting hit like with 10. I'd say that probably accounting for past unsolved cases, I'd say that it's more likely that like every city maybe gets hit with like three, maybe 10, three, maybe like seven max cases. And the third thing is. And the third thing is, the government actually creates an incentive to actually use modern technology to look back into these old cases and open up new leads. When they actually would have to compensate the victims for leaving these cases cold, it would incentivize them to actually go back and use these more technologies. They responded to that a little bit in cost, but I'll get into that in a minute. And fourth of all, generally like states, if the bare minimum for policing in a community rises because we have to pay like one case every like 5 years, it's more likely that the bar for bare minimum funding will also probably rise too. The reality is that people generally want good policing in their communities. If all of a sudden like police like stations all across the country get some massive hit, it's more likely that they will get more funding because people in their communities want more fun. Who don't want completely police that actually just can't do anything. And third, like y'all going after their case specifically, like their points of interest, like a lot of their points actually don't have many mechs. They kind of just say things and don't actually tell you why it happens. First, in officer training, they say the officer training gets worse, but they don't really give you any reason besides like a massive hit to budget, besides like some idea of a massive hit to budget. And insofar as I've largely mitigated that hit to the budget, like very small, I don't think you actually see it there. Now onto their point of like police over policing and just abuse of the system. First of all, I'd like to say that the OO says themselves that police generally have a strong sense of justice. I'd say that if many of these acts are like, I consider like over policing generally pretty high in the injustice sense. I think if a lot of these I'd say a lot of these police officers, despite like what their superiors are saying, if they have a strong sense of justice, they'll probably oppose this. They'll probably oppose this. Actually, we saw this during the we saw this where like in 2020, a lot of like police brutality things were coming out, especially with like the BLM marches. Actually, there's a spike in police resignations because the police officers were seeing injustice in their system and they were resigning. However, they didn't actually resign. What ended up happening was the threat of resigning actually forced the upper echelons of the police offices to fold because they couldn't afford it. And next up on this idea of like yeah. And so on this idea of like harsher interrogations, we'd like to say that it's less likely that they go to false accusations. One, because false accusations don't have proof. Especially with today, with modern technology, a lot of these false accusations will be thrown out. And it's unlikely that a lot of these cops will risk it, especially when it risks their professional careers. Before I continue, I'll take a POI from POI.
If police are already underfunded in this status quo, why will be there a significant increase on funding on your side of the house?
So it's not about significant increase in funding. It's about one, if there is like some massive hit to funding, people will probably respond because people don't want police that literally can't do anything in their neighborhoods. People want policing. Second of all, like it's unlikely that this hit is even that high because one, a lot of these cases that are like the ones that are unresolved are cases that are unlikely, like pretty rare in the first place. Two, especially more so nowadays and even in the past, like a lot of these cases, majority of these cases were solved, and nowadays like 99% of these cases are actually solved. The ones that are unresolved are pretty rare, and we'd say that the ones that are unresolved, the victims should still get compensation. We see here is that what this comes down to is our principle that's largely unresponded to. It's this idea of giving like victims compensation. They talk about how like victims don't want to see the criminals out on the streets, but the problem is now with funding on actually solving these cases. The problem is the vast majority of these cases, the problem is because there's actually just a lack of hard evidence. It's because there's a lack of like really hard evidence that allows them to come to a conclusion and allow to like lock someone up. The reality here is that the counter world is not one where like all of a sudden like murderers and rapists are walking around scot-free. The reality is that in the world we have right now, there's many people who are that way, who are murderers and rapists walking around scot-free, and the victims are not getting their justice. What we see here is that the narrative my partner introduced was entirely unresponded to. We see here is that you must uphold this principle of reparations and justice. We have to this is a key principle to our society. We see here is that the victims, their lives and how they interact with their lives is fundamentally changed. The way they actually are able to the way they actually go about their lives after they suffer these violent crimes is their lives are largely destroyed. And their sense of normalcy is destroyed. What we see here is that even though we are not able to fix it through reparations, we're able to take a first step towards normalcy by doing these reparations. It is signaling to the victims that yes, you were victimized. Yes, you were the victim. We are not ignoring you. We are giving you some compensation for that, and it helps the victims restore some sense of normalcy. You must weigh this round off this victim's sense of normalcy. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Call it DLO.
Hello, am I audible?
Am I audible? Hello.
Could you say that again?
Hello.
Yeah, louder.
Okay. Just give me a few moments. Raise POIs through raise hand function. If not chat, matter of fact, I'll open chat right now. But I do prioritize just raise hand. The first thing that I want to respond to coming from opening opposition is this idea on funding. The first response under this is to just point out how the policy works, because the assumption in the policy motion is that the policy is something that is going to be applied from this point onwards. It's not something that will be applied retrospectively. So if the concern is that there's a lot of unresolved cases in the past, that's not something that is covered by the debate, and is something that's entirely asserted by opening opposition. The intuition pump under this is to just look at how past unresolved cases, for example, are not exactly the responsibility of the current police, for example. Like they're not the reason why those past cases were like messed up, for example. So because of this, what we can assume is that there's significantly less cases that you will have to deal with these types of these types of compensation in comparison to what opening opposition wants you to believe. The second response on this is to just say that it's true that the police is generally proficient. So therefore, I think it's reasonable to assume that there's going to be a low frequency of unresolved crimes that will happen, precisely because for a crime to be solved, it doesn't often mean that you have to get convictions. It just often means that you have to know all of the details of the crime, for example, with reasonable amount of evidence. The third thing under this is that the police receive a lot of funding from a lot of from the central government. So this looks like through conservative support, for example, that often want the police to double down on like how they want to protect the country. For example, they often double down on increasing funding in law enforcement, etc. But the last under this is just, in principle, the police are more beholden to present harms anyway, because there are the more immediate harms in comparison to what you're able to like potentially accrue in the future, because a lot of the things that are happening right now are already guaranteed. So yeah, I'll proceed to the clearing of the model, right? I'll clearing it up a bit more. So the first thing under the model is something that will apply from now to the future. But the second is just the way that we decide settlements will be settled through legal systems with lawyers present for both parties, for example, in order to decide the proportional amount to the damages that the victims have sustained. So it is going to be a reasonable amount still to people. But the next thing here is just that I think during this time is during the time frame, for example, that you set, at which a lot of these things will still be deemed to be solvable, is when the police is still obligated to continue investigating a lot of these cases, as opposed to dropping this case, which I would assert a lot of these cases get dropped in the world of opposition, precisely because the way that the police system works right now is through things such as quotas, for example, where it's often seen as unproductive for you to try to resolve one case as opposed to solving like 10 petty crimes, for example. Is often something like the police in their side is far more inclined to do, because it like allows them to meet their quotas, etc. The first extension that's coming from closing government is to talk about why exactly this is the only way to fulfill the social contract, because I think the compensation is the only way for the police to be able to fulfill their end in the social contract. Note that this is different from the argumentation that comes from opening government, because this explicitly proves that there's a direct responsibility for the police to prevent a lot of these unresolved crimes to begin with. The premise is quite simple. This is that people give up their rights in exchange for a lot of the protection from the state through things such as law enforcement. People expect that they will always be protected, in which is why they also probably do things such as cooperate with the police, for example, whenever there are investigations. It's probably why they give way to things such as like emergency vehicles whenever they're in the highway, etc. But why does the state violate this then? There are two main reasons. The first is just principally, and this is absolute, when a case goes unresolved, the police fails to uphold their end of the bargain of the social contract at which they give protection, because they already failed to do that at the point at which the crime has been committed. But the second is just when they're unable to resolve a lot of these crimes and find a lot of the people that perpetuated it, it's when they fail to do their job towards the people, for example. So it's when they cannot give reparations for the people, they cannot provide catharsis for the people, they cannot enforce the law and just let a lot of these crimes go away. But so So in those instances, it's just very clear that you failed to do your job, right? But the second is just a lot of unresolved cases right now are partially due to law enforcement faults, for example. So the main cause of unresolved cases currently is often the lack of evidence, which is why a lot of these cases get dropped and why a lot of this get dismissed, for example. And I think this is just something that is very mitigable, right? So this looks like, for example, the lack of surveillance cameras, especially in areas that are poorer, which is where a lot of the crimes typically happen, for example, right? Where a lot of like things such as like mugging and murder happen due to the focus on protecting higher income areas, for example, because they're often the main like funders of the police, or like they're often the biggest demographic, for example, that they want to cater to. So it's because of a lot of these systemic faults that the police is unable to like mitigably amend, even if it's literally their job. So it's like literally their job to make sure that there's no blind spots in every part of the city, for example, for a lot of the crime to take place. It's because of these failings that a lot of these cases get dropped, get dissolved, and often get labeled as unresolved. So what we prove here is that it's precisely the police's fault that things went that way, when otherwise, if they were more preemptive, it probably could have gone the other way, for example. They could have done better, but they did not, which is the main reason why a lot of these cases go unresolved. This proves two things. The first is just the compensation becomes then the only way to offset a lot of the damages that people sustain from being victims of criminal cases, for example, if these are things that cannot be solved. And I want to note that the unique nuance in criminal cases is that they're often very damaging for the people that have to suffer through them. The second is just this becomes then justified in a sense that it's your only way for you to be able to fulfill your end of the burden in the social contract, for example. So you can no longer give them protection, but at the very least, you can give them something to in order to offset a lot of the damages that damages that they sustain as a result of you failing to provide that protection to begin with. Why is this the most important argument in the round? This is just because public trust on the police is already dwindling, and it will continue to dwindle if crimes remain unsolved. They are dwindling precisely because of like how the poor, for example, and the minorities perceive the law enforcement as the enemy due to their historical preference towards like majorities, due to their historical like beating up them, etc. But if at this point in time the crime will go unresolved on both sides, it is significantly better on government for two main reasons. The first is just people get some form of catharsis in the form of reparations that only exist in the world of government. But the second is just you directly contradict the notion that you are the enemy of the people. At the very least, you positively impact the public relations of the police, which is just good because this is where people cooperate more, which makes your future investigations a lot more easier than it currently will be. It's in the world of opposition where a lot of these things will become harder and a lot of these things will go unresolved. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Calling member 4.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay. All good. Let me just put on the timer. POIs in chat. Okay, awesome. 3, 2, 1. If the police are corrupt and complacent, then government wins because they meaningfully spur the police into action. But if the police are already accountable and not corrupted, then OO wins because GovBench does not create a meaningful impact. You would also be taking away money from the police to prevent more crimes. But the problem is, the police are probably corrupt to some degree. Check and balance does not work all the time, but it does work sometime because even if the police is corrupted, it's seldom the case that they're in bed with the mafia or have no incentive to resolve cases. Here's the solution from CO. We are okay with some crimes being overlooked by the police, like unresolved burglaries, if they have as much resources as possible to tackle more serious crimes like serial killers, rapists, and organized crime. Why does this beat out OO? OO says that the police are already accountable because the police attract good people because there's pressure from politicians and the people. But the problem is this proves that there's some accountability. It does not prove that there's always enough accountability. My extension here is that there's definitely always enough accountability for the most serious crimes that we're talking about. The presence of serial killers that strike fear into the entire populace is an accountable mechanism because they have reputation and they attract particular media coverage. There's a reason why serial killers are not known as Suspect X311, but they're known through media nicknames like the Zodiac, the Milwaukee Cannibal, or Jack the Ripper. For organized crime, they do turf wars to shoot up the neighborhood, to recruit from schools, they draw gang signs on public property to demarcate territories. In almost every country, these kind of crimes will evoke enough scrutiny and outrage for the police to start taking actions. However, these are also the crimes that are the hardest to clamp down on. And again, I want to clarify, OO says that there's less resources. I'm going to prove to you that there'll be insufficient resources to clamp down on these people. This is because serial killers and organized crime are prime perpetrators of unresolved crimes. This for three reasons. The first is just natural selection. Look, they become serial killers and career criminals because they didn't get caught. They didn't get caught. Among all the criminals there are, they're just the good ones. So they know where the blind spots are. They know how to avoid police investigation. They know who to pay off. The second reason is that they oftentimes have an incentive to create crime. They aren't stealing out of necessity. They're killing and raping people for gratifications. They're shooting up neighborhoods to assert fear so they can claim more territories to sell drugs in or extort local businesses for protection money, which means that there's a clear profit incentive. The last reason is that particularly for organized crime, even if it's the case that you know who did it, gathering evidence to prosecute is a nightmare because you have to slowly remove corrupt policemen who are tipping them off. You have to find and protect witnesses before the mafia gets to them, before they get intimidated or killed off, etc. So, it's just oftentimes that these are the criminals that create unresolved crimes. On a comparative, I suppose sometimes you have a bar fight that unfortunately ended in manslaughter, or a mother that robs people to feed his family, and these crimes may be unresolved, but they happen far less often. Even if it's the case that they happen more often because they're just more petty criminals as opposed to organized criminals and serial killers and rapists, these kind of crimes just don't damage society as much. So I'm going to do the real trade-off here. It's okay that these crimes happen more often because we keep the police and the city well-funded. This is because assuming these criminals exist in the city, and I have already proven that the backlash is so strong, all of these resources will be used against all of these worst of the criminals. I'm going to again do more than OO, because OO proved to you that there is going to be less money for the police to work with. What I'm going to do to you is prove the tipping point of insufficient resources. 3 reasons why Gov Bench cripples the police against serial killers, rapists, and career criminals. The first, to be fair, I have 2 reasons. So 2 reasons. The first reason is that if your criminal opponents are being crafty, you need to out-resource them. A criminal empire makes them powerful, but also makes them more vulnerable. You need the ability to, for example, wiretap and surveil everyone within the criminal organization and work up your chain slowly. You need to be able to do, for example, investigation and year-long undercover operations in order to extract crucial information. You need to be able to hire more policemen to bust their money makers to, for example, protect witnesses, to encourage more people to speak up. This is a certain mechanism because oftentimes the state will have more money than criminal operations. The point here is to preserve that money in the system so that they can be used against the worst perpetrators as opposed to be distributed out to members of the public who will end up becoming victims of these criminals anyway. The second mechanism is that if serial killers and criminals both have the ability and the incentive to create and get away with crimes, the emergence of these criminal organizations destroy the police. 6 months of no arrest and you have to pay up. You're literally kidding, right? Can you just imagine the crime rate in Chicago, in Tijuana right now? If bigger criminal organizations mean that there is a more poorly funded police, you just doom every police, every city to violent crimes. I want to note that this is superior to the mechanism of OO because OO's mechanism is retrospective compensation. I think CG pointed out this is probably not congruent with the motion. It's not exclusive. So therefore, OO falls to CG, but not us. We don't have to defend retrospective compensation. But I also want to point out that if it's the case that you defend the city and not the police, our mechanism still works because the city has to defend welfare and education. Then they become recruitment ground for organized crime. Organized crimes become more powerful, commits more crimes, further weakening the police, creating a vicious cycle. I'll take one from closing.
So what is a possibility that we will get these serial killers just because we have more resources as the police, if these killers are indeed so crafty?
Man, I don't know what is the probability. I just know that we will be sure to focus on them because the media draws attention and people are fearful. And with the resources, it goes somewhere. So as I've mentioned, like investigations, more policemen, surveillance, etc., etc. Okay, but on that, my last extension is just simply to explain why recorded but unclosed cases is still a net good and thus should not be punished. It's quite simple. The way you catch serial killers and organized crime is to trace their steps and build a case slowly, because the model of operation and the psychological profile of a serial killer and rapist only becomes revealed with repetition. The connections between victims linking to a complex criminal operation only gets revealed with time, when you can assess similarities. So this kills CG because CG's case is dependent on the social contract being violated, but the contract is not violated. It's still being upheld. It's just going to structurally take up more time. This also, more importantly, helps us hijack the impact of lower rates of crime reporting from OG. OG's harm is just that, yeah, there are unrecorded crimes. But our impact, however, is that these records may become important later on for us to build a concrete case to draw more attention, for us to identify serial killers, rapists, and career criminals. These are exclusive impacts that come out from us because of the fact that we target the criminals to hurt society to the largest degree. I think we're able to take that trade-off.
Thank you for that, colleague of Whip.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, I'll just arrange my notes. Okay. POS to chat, voice, raising hand, whatever you like. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Go. I'll first start with closing opposition. So, in response to our case, MO simply forwards another crime that they tell is more important in this debate, like serial killers, terrorist organizations. The first observation here is that they don't actually take down the principle of CG, that unresolved cases are a violation of the social contract. They don't respond specifically to the mechanism from Kyle that explains why the reason why these crimes are partially unresolved is also because of ineptitude by the police. The fact that they selectively choose to surveil select communities only at the expense of things like ghettos or poorer urban or poorer communities. But secondly, their CO's response is that, well, we can still uphold the social contract in the future when we prevent serial killers from doing more harm to society. Firstly, they have to prove the likelihood of success that they will be able to capture these serial killers and high-profile individuals to begin with. CO at the first part of their speech outlines how hard they are to capture. It's just not clear to me why more resources, which presumably already exists in status quo, because the police is a very rich, or in some context at least, the police are very well funded. It's unclear to me why more funding will allow them to capture these very shady, very crafty, very creative individuals. So in order for them to fulfill the social contract on their side, which is by the way futuristic, the opposite should be passed to explain why they're able to capture them by virtue of more resources at that. But secondly, saying that we can still protect citizens from future harms is not a response to Cal's explanation that we have to reparate present harms done to these victims by virtue of unresolved criminal cases. So just because you protect them from future harms does not absolve the police force from their obligation to reparate the current generation from unresolved present criminal cases. So the principle from CG still stands. But secondly, the frame is unimportant, because if it's about high-profile cases like serial killers, cartels, terrorist organizations, these are cases that are not exclusively handled by the police alone, but also handled by the military, the FBI, the Interpol jointly, because of the recognition that these are very high-risk individuals that require interagency collaboration. But secondly, these are individuals who have the capacity to cross national borders. So if CO's harm is that we underfund the police, that's okay, because there are other agencies separate from the police who can also take the part of capturing serial killers like the police, like the military or the FBI or the Interpol, which have separate funding sources to begin with. So this explains why CO does not meet the burden of proof of explaining why underfunding directly translates to us not being able to protect the citizens from serial killers at that. What I'll do next is to focus on opening opposition. The first thing, what I want to first respond to is on the idea that making them compensate makes the police more harsh in their investigations. The simple response to this is their first argument. They explain at LO in their first argument that the police is often very proficient. They're subject to media scrutiny and public pressure, which also resolves their fourth argument about how the police becomes harsh. Because if it's true that there is huge media scrutiny, the propensity for the police to do these harsh investigations and torture potential suspects is very unlikely to happen because the media is watching the police. The second that I'd like to respond to from opening opposition is about the future capacity of the police, which is a shared premise, by the way, from closing opposition. Closing opposition simply magnifies the impact. Firstly, this is the future capacity of the police unresponsive to the principle from MG that unresolved cases are violation of the social contract. States promise protection, but citizens didn't receive it when cases are unresolved. Note, this argument is not hinged on whether there are factors that the police can control or not control. What matters is that the state, through the police, promise protection for its people in exchange for the people giving up some of its rights so that the states can govern over them. The fact that they have unresolved criminal cases is a violation of that contract that the state has to fulfill regardless of the outcome. Note, OG only says we need justice. What CG says is that it is not justice that is needed, but an upholdment of a contract that states and citizens consented to having the moment states and citizens were born and created. What is the weighing in terms of present and future harms? Firstly, present harms are more important because these are individuals whose lives have already been affected compared to future individuals who are yet to be born. But secondly, it is the present generation that elected the politicians that put the current police force in power. But thirdly, the police are also the indirectly responsible for some of these cases going unresolved. A case in point, the surveillance example that comes from MG. So this just means that their harms are far off in the future. It is uncertain why the current generation of the police force is obligated to them. But secondly, the absence of compensation for unresolved cases at present generates tangible harm to society. When individuals do not receive compensation for their unresolved criminal cases, they often go to vigilantism. The individuals undergo matters in their own hands, or B, they undergo voter apathy because they don't go to elections because they feel like the state does not have the capacity to protect them or feels that the state has neglected them. These harms also affect society. In fact, they prevent the police from conducting future operations optimally. So, for instance, vigilantism means that citizens don't cooperate with the police. If they find evidence, they don't give it willingly to police, which hampers police investigations in the future. If victims experience voter apathy, victims don't support advocacies that increase police budget in the future. Note that short-term harms, as explained by this argument from MG, also generate future harms, which, by the way, is the win condition of both op teams here. PY from OO.
We give you a bunch of reasons as to why criminal rates are gonna arise on your side of the house, which you actually do not really respond, and the prevention is gonna be not guaranteed on your side. So we flip your social contract theory.
So like your mechanism for making criminal rates higher is the fact that we underfund the police and allow more criminals to go haywire. But that is not a direct response to the social contract argument, which explains that harms have already happened. We have to reparate them. Instead of saying that future harms will happen, we have to protect them preemptively. I already weighed why present harms are far more important than future harms. Obviously, in a debate, we can't get all the slices in a pie, right? We have to explain why the pieces that we get are more important. What we do is explain why the present is more important compared to yours, where you just asserted that the future harms are more important to prioritize. Very briefly, why are we better than opening gov? Firstly, opening gov impacts that when we compensate, we create solace and a sense of normalcy for individuals. What we do from closing government is explain why we have to give this form of solace and normalcy, because it is a product of a contract that we have to oblige and that we have to fulfill. Very proud to propose.
Thank you for that, colleague Opip.